Hi everyone, I'm Vince Vitale, and I wanted to share with you, particularly in this season, a talk called Are You Carrying the World? For the last year or so, I've been thinking about themes of anxiety, stress, burden, that pressure in life that builds up behind a dam and threatens to burst through. What do we do with that? And there's a verse in Scripture that says, cast your anxiety or your burden onto Jesus because He cares for you. That's a nice metaphor, this idea of casting burden or fear or stress. But what does it actually mean? What practically does it look like to cast that burden? And this talk is called Are You Carrying the World? And it seems especially relevant right now in this season of the coronavirus, where we have a worldwide pandemic, and we are wondering, is the weight and the burden of the world going to land on us? Is it going to crush us? I hope in this talk you'll find encouragement, you'll find a hopefulness, and practically you'll find what it looks like to take your burdens or your stress, your anxiety, and cast it onto the person of Jesus who longs to carry it for you.
One of my most vivid images from childhood is from New York City. Every Christmas, my family would go to see the tree, and as we were walking through Manhattan, my brother and I would be complaining about how cold it was. But Uncle Tommy would be quick to tell us to stop our whining, and he would give us a lecture about how much harder life was when he was a kid. Did you know that he had to walk to school uphill both ways in 3 feet of snow in just a t-shirt? And then he had to pay his way through college, and he would share that he actually started modeling so that he could pay for his tuition. And he would share that quite proudly, that he even modeled for a few statues. And then we would turn the corner, and he would point to this. Atlas, the Greek god, pictured here at Rockefeller Center, holding the celestial heavens above his head. And as you look at that image, I wonder what word comes to mind for you. For me, the words were strength, success, winning, conquering the world. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, if there were gods, how could I bear not to be a god? That's what I felt when I saw this. That's who I wanted to be. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to be Nietzsche's Uberman. I wanted to be a Greek god. This symbolized the mantras of my youth. Never show weakness. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. You can do anything if you just put your mind to it. The future is bright. Nothing is impossible. As a child, I had these great expectations for life. I remember asking my dad on one of my birthdays, I must have been about 8 years old, and I asked him if he would build me a ladder up this massive tree in our backyard. And so he built a few steps, and I made a deal with him that every year on my birthday he would build a few more steps. And I remember imagining that many years from then I'd be able to climb up hundreds of feet and look out over the entire neighborhood. I remember as a child believing that I could fly. And I don't mean on Delta. I remember going into the backyard and closing my eyes, just putting my mind to it and just thinking that if I just tried hard enough, I might just open my eyes to find myself several feet off the ground. Anyone else do that? A couple honest people. I remember believing that I would never die. I would try to imagine coming to that point in my life, conceiving of taking my final breath, and I just couldn't conceive of it. As a child, I had these great expectations for life. I had this deep sense that the universe was on my side and things were going to turn out well. I was going to be a professional athlete, a successful professional, a Greek god. But then the harsh realities of life, they began to chip away and chip away and chip away at that childhood idealism. I experienced failure. I experienced bullying. I experienced shame. I experienced loved ones dying. My cousin Charles went to dinner with my Aunt Regina and started choking on a bite of chicken. And a few minutes later, they couldn't get him to start breathing again. And that was it. I came to understand the fragility of life and the naivety of my youth, and before long, childhood idealism had become adult realism, and then adult cynicism, and pretty soon I began to just settle for hedonism. And I started to rethink those mantras from my childhood. Never show weakness. Well, I wasn't trying to, but it didn't seem like I had much of a choice. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Really? In this broken world, it seems like there's so much to fear other than fear itself. You can do anything if you just put your mind to it. Are you sure? Because I stood in the backyard and I closed my eyes and I really put my mind to it. And when I opened my eyes, my feet were still firmly planted on the ground. The future is bright. Is it? For who? For everyone? Or just for the lucky few? I've been journeying with a seeker named Dillon. And Dillon says that life is like a movie. But the problem, he says, is that the credits never roll. When you finally work through an obstacle and there's finally resolution and you've finally gotten through it, he said the credits never roll. It just cycles back into the same problems, the same challenges, the same frustrations over and over and over again. Albert Camus likened life to the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a mountain over and over again. And he would roll that boulder up the mountain only to watch it roll back down. And he would roll it up the mountain again only to watch it roll back down. Camus said we face never-ending defeat. I wonder if some of us can relate. When I meet people, I like to really ask them how they're doing. I prefer not to go with just a standard question like, how are you? I like to ask a more creative question, a question like, what causes 80% of your stress in life? That's one of my favorite questions, and the very first time I ever asked that question of anyone, without missing a beat, they immediately responded, people like you asking me questions like that. I said, well, what about the other 20%? And we had a great conversation. But asking that question regularly has convinced me not many people have held on to their childhood idealism. Not many people have held on to their childhood dreams. For many of us, life is already not turning out the way that we dreamed it would. There's a second famous depiction of Atlas. This is the Farnese Atlas. It's a 2nd century Roman marble statue. It's actually the oldest depiction of Atlas that we have. And it's a very different depiction. He's kneeling. He's older. His head is pushed to the side uncomfortably. He looks unbalanced. Doesn't look like Atlas can hold the heavens for much longer. And I wonder what words come to mind when you see this depiction of Atlas. For me, it's burdened, weighed down, defeated, tired, crushed. I wonder if anyone in the room thought of the word me. That's me. That's how I feel. And this is actually a more accurate depiction of the myth of Atlas, because Atlas is not holding the heavens in victory, he's holding the heavens in defeat. Atlas and the Titans had warred against Zeus and the Olympians, and they had lost. And so Zeus is punishing Atlas by forcing him to hold the heavens for all eternity. Atlas is not a symbol of success, but of punishment. And I find it very interesting how easily we confuse the two. How do we set out for success? We set out to be that triumphant Atlas. And before we know it, we're punished. We're broken. We're on our knees. How do we set out to have the world in the palm of our hand, only to be crushed under the weight of it? What is the process by which that happens? I recently asked a mental health expert that question. And here's what she told me. She told me that burden or anxiety or pressure in life is like water pressure building up behind a dam. And it builds day by day and year by year. First, you have that pressure of grades, trying to do good at school. Then you have that pressure of popularity that Casey was talking about. And then before long, you're worried about dating, and you have that pressure, but you still have the pressure of popularity. You still have the pressure of grades. And then maybe you graduate, and now you have a job. You have this significant financial responsibility. Then maybe you wind up getting married. Now you have this responsibility, this pressure of being a good husband or a good wife, but you still have some of these other pressures as well. And then you have a child. Now there's a life that's entrusted to you, but you still have that responsibility of the spouse. You still have that responsibility of work. And then you have another child, and you can't just give up the responsibility of the first child because you had the second child. I know some of you are wondering, but you can't. And then you start to get older, and now you're worried about your health as it starts to deteriorate, and then you start worrying about finances. Have I provided enough for the family? You're worried about finances. You're worried about health. You're worried about your children. You're worried about your other child. You're worried about your spouse. You're worried about work. You're still worried about being popular. And once this pressure begins to build, once you feel it beginning to build, you find yourself lying in bed for hours staring at pictures of yourself. Because if you don't post the right profile picture, then you're not going to be popular. People are going to make fun of you. And then you're not going to get the right job. And then no one's going to want to marry you. And then you're going to be all alone. And you're going to have no money. And you're going to have no friends. And you're just going to be waiting to be told that you have a terminal disease. And yes, that seems overly dramatic. But is it? Over 30% of people will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. 1 in 3. And here's the scary thing. When the pressure behind that dam in your life is just 1 pound less than the dam can take, everything on the other side looks completely normal. And then when that pressure is just 1 pound more than the dam can take, it breaks. And then you have utter catastrophe. And this is happening to so many people. The dam is ready to break. I recently did an amateur analysis of the top 1,000 questions on Google. That will teach you a lot about human nature. And it starts with some random questions. What's my IP address? How do you tie a tie? Then it gets into some funny ones. How old am I? Number 41. Slightly concerning that people have to go to Google to get the answer to that question, though I am encouraged to see that people old enough to forget their age now know how to use Google. Slightly farther down, one of the top questions, why is my poop green? Some questions are clearly better left unanswered. In fact, the only place that you would ever get an answer to that question is at Reboot. Hashtag no question off limits. And we'll even find some way to tie it into the gospel. A little farther down, why are cats scared of cucumber? Why are thousands of people asking that question? What are people doing with their cucumbers? You go through this list, and you have these random questions, and then you have these funny questions. And then you get to the first 3 questions of any substance. I'm not talking about specifically spiritual substance, but the first 3 questions of any substance whatsoever. Number 179, how do you kill yourself? Number 194, what happens when you die? And then slightly lower, how can I love myself? The suicide rate for 18 to 19-year-olds rose 56% between 2008 and 2017. 56% in less than a decade. There's now a suicide in this country every 12.3 minutes. That's more than war, murder, and natural disasters combined. Let me ask you, how much water is behind your dam? And for how much longer can you hold it back? You might say to me, I'm strong. I can take it. But remember, it's precisely because Atlas was strong enough to lift the heavens above his head that he also could be crushed by them. However much longer you can hold that water pressure back before it comes through the dam, it's that greater of a catastrophe when it finally does. So what are we supposed to do? Well, I saw a commercial a while back that suggested one solution. It was kind of an odd commercial, but it depicted a baby being born. And then over the next 30 seconds, this baby flew through the air and went through each stage of life. And so the infant became a toddler and then an adolescent and then an adult and began to get older and came into middle age and then became elderly and the back started to hunch over and the hair went gray. And then at the end of this commercial, this person crashed into a grave dead. And then the screen went black and words appeared across the screen. Life is short. Play more Xbox. And I responded exactly like you did. I laughed. I thought, that's funny. That's hysterical. But then I also sort of caught myself, and I thought, that's also devastating. Really? Play more Xbox? Is that the best we've got? Life is short. It's full of brokenness. It's all headed towards death and injustice, but there's nothing you can do about it anyway. So just try to distract yourself, find some ways to entertain yourself, find some coping mechanisms, play more Xbox. Is that really the best that we've got? Maybe instead of distracting ourselves, what we need to do is stare our problems in the face and see that they aren't as big as we thought they were. This is how some forms of cognitive therapy work. Those with anxiety disorders are typically understood to be overestimating or to be exaggerating the danger of the things that they're worried about. And cognitive therapy is designed to help us to see that our anxiety or our fear is out of proportion with the reality of the circumstances that are causing it. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes that can be very helpful. That's all fine and good when we're talking about an irrational fear. But what if our most fundamental fears are not out of proportion with reality? What about when we fear that the relationships that mean the most to us won't last? What about when we fear that we'll never accomplish our dreams, that despite all of the effort that we've put in rolling that boulder up the mountain, in the end we will just live a life of mediocrity and insignificance? What about when we fear loneliness and suffering and death? What do we do when our most fundamental fears are not irrational, when they are very firmly grounded in the reality of this broken world? What do we do when the burdens that we are carrying are legitimately too heavy for us to carry? Only one thing will help. This is a third depiction of Atlas, and here he's depicted handing the celestial heavens over to Hercules. The only thing that will help when we are carrying a burden that is too heavy for us to carry is to hand that burden on to someone else. And this is how the myth of Atlas and Hercules unfolds. Hercules needed some golden apples, but he had a slight problem because these golden apples were guarded by an immortal dragon with 100 heads. So Hercules went to Atlas and he said, I'd like to make a deal with you. I will take the heavens from you for all eternity if you will go and get these golden apples for me. And Atlas was quick to say, absolutely, I will do that. That's a good deal. Anything but these heavens. I eat dragons for breakfast. And Atlas went off, and he did. He got those golden apples. And he brought them back, and he showed them to Hercules, and he said, I did it. And Hercules said, that's fantastic. I will honor my half of the bargain. I will continue to hold the celestial heavens for you for all eternity. Just one thing, he said. Will you just take them back just for a moment so that I can go and get some soft padding to put on my shoulders? Atlas said, no problem. And he took the heavens back from Hercules just for a moment, and Hercules bent down and picked up the golden apples and ran off. That right there is the problem. Who can we hand our burdens to? You may have thousands of friends on Facebook, not as many as Ravi, but a lot. But if your life was falling apart and everything was closing in and getting darker and darker and more helpless, and you were in crisis and you needed someone to drop everything and do whatever it took to carry your burdens, who would you call? If I'm carrying a heavy burden, can I give it to you? It's not so clear. You're carrying the burdens of your own life. Can I just pile mine on top of that? And what if I need you when you're not available? What if I need you when you're out of town? What if I need you in the middle of the night? And sometimes the burdens that we're talking about, they're just too heavy. If we're just talking about the groceries, fine, you take half, I'll take half, we'll get them inside. If I need you to help me carry a couch, fine, you take that end, I'll take this end, we'll get it done. But those aren't the burdens that we're talking about. We're talking about abuse, sickness, anxiety, injustice, shame, guilt, trauma, suffering, depression, death. Who can carry those burdens? Who's strong enough and present enough and willing enough? And here's the most important question: how can we trust that they aren't going to just trick us and hand those burdens right back, heavier than ever before, turn their backs on us and run off? One of the students that we recently had the privilege of training at our Emerging Apologist program at the Zacharias Institute is a professor of psychology, and he's also a clinical therapist. And he told us of a young woman who came to him, and she had a long history of cutting herself. And they had their first session. And then at the end of the first session, she turned to him and she said, well, there's just one more thing before I can decide if I can trust whether you can work with me or not. And then she rolled up her sleeves and she said, will you touch my scars? And he asked her why that was important to her. And she said, that's the only way I'll really know if you care about me. If you are willing to cross a divide to touch my scars and my wounds. As this Harvard psychologist put it, she needed to know, will you viscerally descend into the darkness with me? Will you reach out and be identified with my brokenness? Are you willing to reach out and put your being into mine? And through their counseling, he had the privilege of sharing with her that there is one person who was literally willing to put his being into ours, who was willing to reach out and be identified with our brokenness, who was willing to reach out and touch her scars. And Jesus went even further than that. Not only was he willing to reach out and touch her scars, but he was willing to be scarred for her. And then he invited her to reach out and touch his scars. Put your finger here. See my hand. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. We can trust Jesus with our scars because he trusted us with his scars. Many things compete to be gods in our lives, to be the ones who will save us from the burdens that we bear and the scars that they leave. But not all of them are trustworthy. Hercules was the son of a god and also the son of a woman. But Atlas had warred against Hercules' father, Zeus, and so Hercules came for revenge. And he deceived Atlas with golden apples only to shame him and punish him and place his burden back on his shoulders heavier than it had ever been before. There is another character who was both God and man. This one not a mythical character, but one who proved his character in history. And in another story about forbidden fruit, we warred against his father. And he had every reason to punish us. Instead, he became the true Atlas, the one who held the universe in his hands, who literally had created it and sustained it and who breathed life into it at every moment, who then voluntarily dropped to his knees. He chose to be crushed by the very universe he had created. Though he had no burden of his own, he took our burden and he hoisted it up on his shoulders, and then he carried it to the top of a hill, and there he stretched out his arms. They thought that they were nailing his hands into a beam, but he was nailing our burdens into his hands. And there on that cross, Jesus became the true Atlas who carries the world, who raises his arms, not to carry his own punishment, but to carry our punishment. And Jesus kept those scars in his hands and in his feet to remind us that he will never give our burdens back. They are his to carry once and for all. It is finished. And that finally answered for that young woman who rolled up her sleeves the question of who she could hand her burden to, of who she could cast her burden onto, of who she could trust with her scars. She put her trust in Jesus Christ. And then she spoke these stunning words. She said, I know now that my scars likely will not disappear, but I have hope that one day they will bear the glory of the one who was scarred for me. Every one of us has scars. Are your scars destined to bear the glory of the one who was scarred for you? The Bible is full of people who cast their burdens onto God's broad shoulders. The Apostle Paul is one. He was shipwrecked, he was stoned, he was imprisoned several times. But he wrote these words from prison. He said, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And because of my chains, not despite them, but because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord, and they dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. Is your God that big? Is he so big that he could take the biggest burden in your life, whatever it is that's imprisoning you, and do more in your life, more in you and through you, not only despite it, but even because of it? A few months ago, during a church service, I experienced some of the most beautiful musical worship that I've ever encountered. I want to play just a few seconds of that worship for you now.
It's what our hearts long for, to be overcome by your presence, Lord.
That music is being sung by Austin Bernard. And the reason it was so beautiful to worship with him was because he meant every word that he sang. Each word was so clearly coming from so deeply within him. That worship and that church service occurred in Angola prison, the largest maximum security prison in America, where Austin is serving 3 life sentences. And after the service, I went up to him to thank him for how beautifully he had led us. And he immediately turned to me and he said, will you pray for me, brother? He said, I'm here serving 3 life sentences. But there's a Bible college in this prison. And I started taking courses at that college. And Jesus found me. I found Jesus. And I have just completed my Master's of Divinity degree, and I've been ordained. And next week, I am being sent from this prison to another prison as a missionary in the hope of planting a church there. Will you pray for me? 3 life sentences. What an impossible burden to carry. But Austin wasn't carrying it. Jesus was. Austin knew exactly what he was in for. He was in prison for Christ. And therefore he could sing from the depths of his soul, I've tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, where my heart becomes free and my shame is undone by your presence, Lord. God's word doesn't just tell us what's possible 2,000 years ago. It tells us what's possible today. It tells us what's possible in your life. What are you imprisoned by? What are the chains that are holding you back? What are your burdens? What are you carrying today that you can't carry for a single day longer? And the most important question, who can you trust to hand it to? I'd love to invite you to just bow your heads with me as we close, because I would love to pray for you. And I believe that many of us have showed up this weekend carrying heavy burdens, carrying burdens today that we need to not be carrying by the end of this weekend. We need to hand them over to the God who says, cast all of your anxiety on me because I care for you. The image that I've had in my heart as I prepared this message was one of a little child who was straining to carry something, straining every muscle in his body, so afraid to let go of it, so afraid to let it fall and break. But what that child didn't know was that his father was walking right beside him every step of the way with his hands open, ready to catch anything that the child let go of. So I just want to extend to us, as we bow our heads, just a simple invitation this afternoon. If you know that you need to let go of something this weekend, if you know that you need to stop trying to carry something yourself and you need to know that God will carry it for you, then I'll just invite you right now to just raise a hand. Just as that sign, just between you and God. Thank you. I see the hands across the room. Just your way of saying, Lord, this is my prayer. I've been carrying something for far too long. I need to let it go. I need you to be my true atlas. I need you to carry it for me. And I raise my hand, not as a hand raised to carry the world myself, but as a hand raised to release this burden to you, the only one who can carry my world. Lord, I raise my hand with my dear brothers and sisters today. Lord, on this Thursday, I say to you that I'm letting go of a burden that I've been carrying, and I need you to catch it. I'm casting a burden onto you, Lord, and I need you to carry it. And Lord Jesus, I say right now in my heart that I trust that you will, Lord, because you've already carried the greatest burden in my life, the burden that sent you to that cross. Lord, you reached out and touched my deepest scars. Thank you. You reached out and you were scarred on my behalf, Lord. You were scarred in my place, and I thank you for that. Lord, hear my cry today. Please bear my burden. Take that weight off of my shoulder. Give me that hope that even the burdens that I have carried, even the scars that they have left, Lord, that one day they will bear your glory, the glory of the one who was scarred for me. And so, Jesus, we say that we trust you, we honor you, we praise you, we say that you alone are worthy of our worship, and we give ourselves to you today and in the days ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.